that he still has in TARP assets or money, and then it's estimated by some maybe about $50 billion in additional assets. So around $175 billion remaining from TARP, $226 billion sitting there appropriated. I guess that means we've already borrowed 42 cents of every dollar from the Chinese, so we're sitting on it. Then, Department of Defense, and since we've got $78 billion that the Defense Department has unobligated, has been appropriated but unspent, why couldn't we use some of that $78 billion to help eliminate some of the cuts that are being suggested, in fact being demanded, of defense? You got Department of Transportation with $45 billion in unobligated, unspent money from 2010 and 2011. You've got $40 billion from the Department of Health and Human Services sitting there, unobligated, unspent from 2010 and 2011. Department of Housing and Urban Development, $23.8 billion sitting there. Department of Education, $19 billion. And the thought comes, what if we did away with the Department of Education and all that money that comes pouring in to Washington every year, some of it borrowed, and that gets held here in Washington and gets funded to administrators and bureaucrats that have nothing to do with actually teaching anything? How about if we just turn that right around and send it right back to those states and said, we're taking our grimy fingers off of that money. We're not going to keep any of it because we think it is that important that it go for education. And how about if we, by doing that, therefore encourage every state, as I believe as Newt Gingrich suggested, to then let go so many of the administrators in each state capital that are not involved in any kind of teaching, just involved in dictation to local school boards. And of course, for every bureaucrat that we have to have right now in Washington, they have to have at least one in every state capital, and because they've got to carry out the assignments from Washington. And then for everyone in the state capital, you've got to have bureaucrats at each local school district to carry out those assignments. I was shocked to go online and see that one of the best school districts in East Texas was saying that they were proud to note that right at half of all their school district employees were actually teachers. So when I went to look at that a little further, you go back to before President Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education, that number was closer to 75% in Texas. Now it's around 50% in Texas. But before there was a federal Department of Education, about 75% of all Texas education employees were just wonderful school teachers, like my sister, like my wife was. Now, that's getting teachers, that's getting people in the education system where they can do some good. So you got the Department of Education sitting on $19 billion. You go online and look up how many school districts there are in America and divide them into $19 billion, you'd have school districts that were not having to fire teachers right now. That would do a world of good. But we got bureaucrats here in Washington think it's more important that they sit there with a slush fund, $19 billion, unobligated, unspent funds from 2010, 2011. You got the Department of Labor. They've got $18 billion sitting there from 2010 and 2011, and we acknowledge it is important for them to sit on a slush fund because they have so many things they have to do, like they have to run to states like South Carolina and tell them you can't have a new Boeing plant in your state because we're trying to help unions in Washington, even though not one single union worker in Washington was going to lose their job or be adversely affected. We're going to rush in and be not a referee, we're going to be a player referee, and we're going to dictate like used to be done by Caesars, kings, czars, emperors, pharaohs. They thought they had the authority to come into South Carolina and play Pharaoh and say, nope, you're not going to have these jobs. Well, once the unions finally got satisfied, then isn't it amazing that the NLRB backed off some? I think we've seen the NLRB as something we could do away with, and one of our colleagues in our party here in the House has a bill that will do just that. I think it's time to do that. Department of Agriculture, $14 billion sitting unspent, unobligated from 2010, 2011. Department of State, they don't have quite as much money sitting there as some of these other departments, but they still have $8.7 billion sitting unobligated, unspent from the last 2 years. Department of Homeland Security, $7.2 billion. Now, they may want to use some of that to go buy some more of these machines from our friend Secretary Chertoff. What a waste of money those were. Then you've got the Department of the Interior at $6.7 billion sitting unspent, unobligated in their coffers. Department of Energy. A Department of Energy that was set up by President Carter with the purpose of getting us off of dependence on foreign oil. And every year the Department of Energy has existed, one thing has been consistent, and we got to give them credit for this. One thing has been very consistent from the Department of Energy. Every year they've existed, we become more dependent on foreign oil. So, if you're in the private sector and you went these years, 32 years, working on 33 years or so with a department in your business that got further and further from its original goal, you'd probably cancel that department, get rid of it, disband it. Not here in government. Not only are they not doing what would help America by getting us off dependence on foreign oil, they are actually working in conjunction with the Department of Interior to make us more dependent on foreign oil and to limit the amount of production here in the United States. Just today, the President of the United States has had the incredible nerve to step up and say, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans who I am going to deprive of the opportunity to have a good union job. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of more of Americans who would be suppliers for those people who would be working on the Keystone Pipeline. Everything from private suppliers